Okay, I want to focus a little bit on food and hunger. And so some of the things to think about, number one, is there a food shortage in the world? Technically speaking, the whole world is not hungry. Paradoxically, some countries are awash in a sea of grain, so to speak, while people in other parts of the world do not receive their daily required amounts of protein and calories that are necessary to fight off diseases usually associated with malnutrition and hunger. So who are the most hungry? There are estimates that every day over 100 million people on the earth are hungry or malnourished. And this is occurring primarily in less developed countries. So this really becomes an issue of subsistence rights. And what are the causes of hunger? Is it overpopulation? Lack of food? Neither of these, generally speaking. It's because of political and economic factors that really contribute to hunger. And so this is where we think about the theories of international political economy that we talked about in the first lecture about why there is the public policies there that exist. Can they be explained by the theories of IPE about what's either what's being done for hunger or what are the causes of hunger? And so what do we do in terms of solutions? Since World War II, media coverage and public attention of hunger in different places of the world has seemed greatest during or shortly after episodes of localized mass starvation brought on by drought or war. All right, so we have two issues that usually brings on starvation. A drought, which might lead to questions about sustainable development, and then, of course, conflict, which we know creates human rights issues. Yet malnutrition and even starvation remain permanent features of many countries, especially those designated by the UN as most seriously affected, or what's called MSA countries. All right, so this is the issue of how are we going to address these issues that are brought about mainly by drought and war. So we can try and look at a couple of things. First, can we look at the political theories of mercantilism, liberalism, and structuralism that helps explain hunger? And secondly, can there be different views about the causes of hunger as well as the solution to the problem? So here we have if we think about the international political economy of hunger, it points to food security as one of the humankind's basic core values. We can think of food security as a basic need of subsistence, which in the near future is not likely to be realized for all individuals. But this should become an important issue so that we can try to solve the problem of global hunger. All right, what about this history of the hunger debate? If you will recall from the first lecture, we talk about Malthus. Thomas Malthus talks about the principles of population, and he asserts that the population tends to expand exponentially while food supply expands mathematically, and that war, disease, famine, all this is going to limit the speed of population expansion. So since the time of Malthus, food and hunger issues have been seen as a biological race between population growth, that is the demand, and agricultural production, that is the supply. Solutions has focused on increasing the supplies, as through the Green Revolution or foreign aid, or decreasing demand, limiting the population growth. If you have this problem between growth, demand, and supply, you've got to attack them on both sides. So this widely held view, however, misses the real point of the issues of food and hunger. Well, after World War II, concerns over the twin problems of hunger and population growth were expressed by the U.S. and her allies, particularly as it would be a hindrance to economic recovery. The UN's first specialized agency, remember the UN is a new institution born out of World War II, its first specialized agency was the Food and Agricultural Organization, or the FAO, designed to address the world's food needs. And the United States also enacted several programs to deal with the food shortages in developing countries, including Public Law 480 and the U.S. Food for Peace program. Of course, this was tied to ideology. those individuals we were supporting had to be anti-communist. Then, of course, we have the Green Revolution. By the 1960s, efforts were made to improve production around the world, primarily through new varieties of grain. This is where you also start to see the organic food movement. And so this was an attempt to address the pessimism about food output. So on one hand, all these programs after World War II started to deal with production of food. On the other hand, we're going back to our friend Garrett Hardin with the tragedy of the commons. He framed the population food dilemma as a tragedy of the commons based on fundamentals of human nature. Remember, the finiteness of the earth resources and individual self-interested behavior. Recalls that he argued it is in each person's individual interest to have another child, or graze another cow, or add a bit more pollution to the stream, or cut down another tree. Whatever that is, it's in each person's individual self-interest to do more or take more from the environment. But when all people behave accordingly to the self-interest, the consequence is for all of them to suffer. So Hardin advocated drastic measures to offset human nature, such as treating the earth as a lifeboat, and helping only the nations that had a chance to develop, and ignoring food aid or assistance to populations that were hopelessly bogged down with hunger or poverty. Ultimately, he wanted to limit population to limit stress and conflict. There are some countries, however, that are starting to experience negative population growth on their own, as I mentioned before, several in Europe. But of course, there is a whole lot of criticism about the lifeboat ethics. And lifeboat ethics was criticized on many fronts. World food supply has kept up with and even outpaced world food demand. So the problem is primarily one of distribution, not production. The United Nations, among others, reports that population growth rates in developing regions of the world are actually slowing down, resulting in fewer births than expected. So we might be having demographic transition. But for many, Hardin's recommendation to abandon LDCs therefore appears rash because he overlooks the food distribution problem. Namely, that there's enough food produced to feed everyone, and that for many reasons it does not reach the hungry and the malnourished. The Food First thesis was introduced in the 1970s, arguing that hunger is more a matter of income and land distribution than of food production and distribution. The objective is to redistribute food to redress long-standing economic inequality between North and South and within countries. In other words, hunger is not endemic to LDCs, rather it is a byproduct of their political and economic relationship to the industrialized nations. This sounds very much like a Marxist socialist argument, right? That hunger is not endemic to LDCs, rather it is a byproduct of their political and economic relationship to the industrialized nations. And their economic and political relationships were based on colonialism, imperialism, and so these are the vestiges of the remnants of that experience. So from a theoretical perspective, states, subnational groups, and transnational corporations play major roles in the food and hunger problem. Industrialized nations subsidize food exports, for example, which depresses agricultural prices and create hardships for LDC farmers. States also engage in wars and conflicts that disrupt farm production and distribution. So it's states and other groups that impact food and hunger. Markets also play a role because market access is based on the ability to pay, which is unequally distributed. Markets also condition the economic status of a nation, contributing to its inequality. We have food aid, along with other foreign direct investment practices, also influences food production and distribution patterns. Economic liberals, remember, says you should have faith in the market. Liberals tend to see trade in food as a mutually beneficial transaction. Liberals oppose government intervention into food markets, unless, of course, you're talking about farm or export subsidies. They argue instead that markets will lead to the maximum production of food. Liberals also see hunger in LDCs as often resulting from unwise domestic policies, not from unequal agricultural markets. Liberals also discourage long-term dependence on food aid as it serves to distort the market. So liberals tend to put a lot of faith in new technologies such as those of the second-generation green revolution and genetically modified plants and animals to increase food productions. Liberals also generally view multinational corporations as an asset to solving the hunger problem given their positive effects on local economies. The mercantilist perspective, however, they argue that food and hunger issues are tied up with national wealth and power, that nations that produce surplus food supplies benefit from their ability to influence, nations that produce surplus food benefit from their ability to influence other nations. So they're using food as a weapon, as a tool for diplomacy even. Food is one key to power and influence in the international political economy. High productivity states can use food as a carrot or a stick in relations with food poor states. It can also be a weapon, as in the U.S.-USSR trade negotiations of the 1970s. Even during the height of the Cold War, Russia was were suffering because they didn't have enough wheat products. So the United States actually was able to provide wheat to the Soviet Union. Food aid can also be used to encourage expansion of other domestic firms abroad, and this is a very mercantilist perspective. From the Marxist or structuralist perspective, they tend to see food and hunger as a global class issue related to exploitation and imperialism. Dependency theorists in particular see an unequal terms of trade that favors rich nations over poor ones, even terms of trade dealing with food products. They also see multinational corporation, agribusiness, and genetically modified organisms or food as having detrimental effects on LDCs as well as the development of food products locally. So if we look at some basic information, the sum total of food produced would create an average daily caloric intake of between 2,500 to 3,000 calories per day. However, only 10% of the world production is exchanged internationally. So what you have then is famine and undernutrition. So you can see those countries in the dark red, the United States, Western Europe. We eat a lot more calories per day than are needed, but we see those in the lighter colors have less calories on average per day. So famine is a short-term phenomenon that tends to attract political attention, of course. The key issue is how to get food to those affected and or raise their incomes. Undernutrition, on the other hand, is a long-term or chronic phenomenon that eventually kills many more people each year, yet this attracts much less attention. Solving this problem is far more challenging because it involves a more enduring redistribution of income across and within countries. But we've had a history of worldwide crises. So we had a world food crisis in the 1970s. The FAO declared a world food crisis in 1972 because of anticipated grain supply shortages. And part of the grain shortage was due to the U.S.-USSR political choices that were made. Other problems were due to market inequalities, which kept poorer nations from competing for grain in world markets. Of course, there was a famine in Somalia that you're probably more familiar with. This is in the early 1990s. The famine in Somalia demonstrates the link between war and hunger. The UN peacekeeping operation in Somalia marked the first time UN or U.S. forces intervened in a nation for the express purpose of humanitarian relief. But you should know that the UN humanitarian operation turned into a military operation when peacekeepers got into military conflict with local clans. And this became the episode you and I know better as Black Hawk Down, made famous from the book, but also the movie where U.S. Army Rangers and other elite forces were were called into action against the warlords that ended very tragically for all parties. All right. We also have the genetically modified organisms debate. Genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, are those organisms that contain genes that have been artificially inserted into them. Under the World Trade Organization, or the WTO, many industrialized countries are pushing for protection of GMOs as intellectual property, and so U.S. laws make genetic information patentable. But critics point out that it's nearly impossible to invent new GMOs without violating intellectual property agreements, and that firms are engaging in biopiracy, which is threatening the economic heritage of third world countries and farmers that are subject to lawsuits over genetic drift. So I don't want to go too much into this particular issue of GMO, but you can Google this issue, and there is lots of lawsuits because of what is called genetic drift. And this is where if you are planting as an organic farmer and seeds drift over from your neighbor that's not, and you then all of a sudden have genetically modified genes, you're subject to the rules and laws of the company that owns that genetic modified patent. So you could Google, I forget the name of the company that has a lot of these lawsuits going, but I'll try to remember it for the end of the lecture. Monsanto. It's Monsanto who has a lot of issues with genetically modified food. The European Union is particularly concerned about the health and safety of GMOs, and it refuses to accept imports of genetically modified crops. And this has been challenged in front of the WTO dispute settlement body, which has ruled against the EU. In ignoring the ruling, the EU has opened up itself to retaliatory sanctions from GMO exporting states. Some scientists have argued that GMOs will allow crops to be more nutrient dense, grow in a variety of climates, and produce higher yields. These traits could help GM crops offset the global hunger crisis. However, many developing countries refuse to import genetically modified organisms because they don't have the technology and or finances to deal with the fertilization that is required. In addition, you and I eat genetically modified foods all the time. You may not know that, but people in developing countries do not, and so this would have a definite nutritional and health risk involved. And this is why there's lots of U.S. grain sitting in warehouses that are not being distributed because they're not being introduced into developing countries. All right. Past famines that are beyond Africa that we know about. Of course, the Irish potato famine killed about 3 million people in the middle of the 1800s. The Ukrainian famine during the Great Depression, about 20% of their population. The Chinese famine, the data is so hard to ascertain. We know why data is hard to get. We learned about that in the second module. The North Korean famine that happened in the 1990s, not only famine, but people continued to be malnourished. So the questions to consider is to think about what's the dominant explanation of world hunger, and what is the tragedy of the commons? What are lifeboat ethics? How do the theories of IPE view food and hunger problems? And most importantly, how is this all tied to human rights? I think you can clearly see how the issues of food and hunger relate to subsistence rights issues, relates to certain types of economic issues, and these are the types of rights that many people in the developing countries and those working to help those in the developing countries are focusing on, as opposed to many of the political and civil rights that we've been concentrating on for the last couple of weeks. All right, the last lecture is going to deal specifically with the items in the textbook.